Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The quiet night turns loud. The city skyline stretched far into the night, twinkling with a mix of soft streetlights and distant high-rises. It was a cool, quiet evening, the kind of night when people drive home in peace, replaying moments of their day. James Carter adjusted the rearview mirror of his black luxury sedan, the hum of the tires on the highway filling the car with its rhythmic sound. In the passenger seat sat Michael Brooks, his lifelong friend and a fellow pillar of their community. The two men had just left an awards gala, where James had delivered a powerful speech on leadership and resilience. Both men were well-dressed, sharp black suits, tailored to perfection, their ties still snug, and their polished shoes catching the low glow of the dashboard lights. They were professionals, leaders in law enforcement, respected by their colleagues and celebrated by their community. "I still can't believe how packed that hall was," Michael said, leaning back in his seat. "You've really become the voice of change, James." James chuckled softly. "It's not about being a voice, Mike. It's about people listening." The air between them was calm, filled with the comfort of a decades-old friendship. But as James switched lanes, something caught his attention in the rearview mirror. A set of headlights appeared, a patrol car with blue and red lights spinning in the darkness. Michael noticed it too. "You see that?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. James frowned. "Yeah, I see it." He tapped his fingers on the wheel, already feeling his chest tighten. "But we're not speeding, and everything's in order." "Maybe they're just passing by," Michael suggested. But the patrol car didn't pass. It followed. James sighed heavily as the car's siren gave a single, piercing wail, before settling back into silence. He signaled and pulled the car to the shoulder of the road, the patrol car pulling up right behind them. The lights reflected off the rear windshield, washing the interior of the sedan in alternating red and blue hues. James turned off the ignition, resting his hands on the steering wheel in plain sight, years of training and experience telling him exactly what to do. Michael exhaled sharply. "You think it's just a routine stop?" James didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Michael, seeing his friend's jaw tighten. "Let's just stay calm. The encounter begins." Two figures emerged from the patrol car. Both officers were young, too young, James thought, fresh-faced but walking with forced authority. Officer Smith, the taller of the two, approached the driver's side. His partner, Officer Johnson, hovered near the rear of the car, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Smith knocked on the window with the back of his knuckle. "License and registration," he barked, skipping any pleasantries. James remained calm, his voice even and steady. "Sure thing, officer." He reached into the glove compartment slowly, handing over the requested documents along with his ID. "Is there a reason we're being pulled over tonight?" Smith ignored the question, barely glancing at the license, before narrowing his gaze at Michael. "You too," he snapped, pointing toward Michael with a stiff gesture. "ID." Michael hesitated for a beat, then retrieved his wallet. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath as he handed over his ID. James watched Officer Smith carefully. Something about the officer's posture didn't sit right with him. The stiffness of his shoulders. The way his hand lingered near his utility belt. He wasn't just performing a stop, he was searching for something. Smith walked back to the patrol car, his partner close behind. The silence felt oppressive as James and Michael sat waiting, the strobing lights continuing their relentless flash. The occasional car passed by, slowing slightly as drivers turned to gawk. The weight of eyes on them, judging, assuming, felt heavier than the night itself. A question of dignity. Michael finally broke the silence, his voice low and tight. "James, we didn't do anything wrong. You know what this is." James didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the patrol car, the officer silhouetted against the bright dashboard lights. Inside, he was furious, but years of wearing the uniform himself had taught him the dangers of reacting with emotion. This wasn't the first time he had seen situations escalate from nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. Officer Smith's face was unreadable, but his tone remained sharp. "Step out of the car." James blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Smith snapped. "Both of you. Step out of the vehicle." Michael shot James a look, disbelief in his eyes. "For what? What's the reason?" "You're acting suspicious," Smith replied coldly, ignoring the question entirely. Michael scoffed. "Suspicious? For sitting in a parked car? You've got to be kidding me." James placed a calming hand on Michael's arm. "Let's not make this worse." Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, Michael reluctantly following. The two men stood side by side under the glare of the police car's headlights, their calm presence an unspoken protest against the injustice unfolding. Smith approached James first, pulling out his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." James's voice was firm, though he kept it calm. "You still haven't explained why we're being detained." "You can argue your case later," Smith replied dismissively, snapping the handcuffs around James's wrists with a little too much force. Michael's voice rose in protest. "This is harassment. You don't have a reason to do this." Smith turned to Michael with a glare. "You want to keep running your mouth? We'll have you in the back of the car faster than you can say another word." The growing tension. As the two men stood handcuffed, the cold metal biting into their wrists, the injustice of the moment weighed on them. James's mind raced. He wasn't just a man in handcuffs, he was Captain James Carter, one of the most respected officers in the city. He had dedicated his life to justice, yet here he was, reduced to a suspect without cause. Michael, less composed, glanced at the passing cars with frustration. "This is unbelievable. They didn't even ask questions, James." James nodded subtly. "They don't need answers when they've already decided what to see." The officers stood by their patrol car, speaking in hushed tones. Smith looked more relaxed now, almost smug, as though he had accomplished something. Officer Johnson, on the other hand, shifted uneasily, his gaze flickering back to the handcuffed men with growing discomfort. "Run their IDs again," Johnson muttered quietly. Smith waved him off. "It's fine. They fit the description." Johnson's jaw tightened. "Do it anyway." Begrudgingly, Smith returned to the patrol car and ran the IDs through their system. What appeared on the screen made Johnson's heart drop. There, under James Carter's name, flashed his rank, Captain, City Police Department. The realization struck him like a punch. "Smith," he whispered urgently, his voice shaking. "You need to let them go." "What? Why?" "That's Captain Carter," Johnson hissed. "He's our superior." Smith froze. His face paled as the enormity of the mistake hit him. Realizations and ripples. The stillness in the air cracked under the weight of realization. Officer Johnson's face flushed as the truth sank in. They hadn't just pulled over any two men. One of them was Captain James Carter, a name that commanded respect in every precinct of the city. The other, Michael Brooks, was just as well known, a public advocate for justice and former police academy instructor. Johnson's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the screen of the patrol car system, the words on display taunting him. Captain James Carter. High-ranking official, City Police Department. He turned sharply to Officer Smith, his partner, who was still posturing, standing with his arms crossed and a smug expression painted across his face. Johnson's voice dropped into a hurried whisper. "Smith, listen to me. That's Captain Carter." Smith frowned, clearly not understanding. "What?" "Captain James Carter," Johnson hissed again, this time emphasizing every word. "He's a superior officer, our superior officer. You just put cuffs on him." Smith's confident stance faltered. His face drained of color, and his eyes darted toward the two men standing cuffed by the side of the road. The smugness evaporated in an instant. It was replaced with something colder, fear. A mistake like this wouldn't just end with apologies. It could end careers. No way, Smith muttered, but his voice lacked conviction now. You're wrong. That can't. Johnson cut him off, jabbing a finger at the patrol car's monitor. Look for yourself. Smith's gaze followed Johnson's trembling hand. He stared at the screen in silence, his jaw visibly tightening. A beat passed before he finally looked back toward James Carter, who stood tall and composed despite his hands being bound. The captain's face was set with calm authority, but his eyes, sharp, unyielding, spoke volumes. Smith's heart thudded in his chest, a painful rhythm of regret and panic. What have I done? The weight of mistakes. James Carter watched the two officers closely. He saw Johnson whispering urgently to Smith, their silhouettes framed by the patrol car's glowing headlights. His instincts told him what was happening. They know now. Michael, standing beside him, grumbled under his breath. What are they doing now? Having a conference? Probably realizing their mistake, James replied quietly. There was no anger in his voice, but there was weariness, an exhaustion born from living through this kind of injustice far too many times. Michael shot him a look, disbelief and frustration in his expression. Realizing? It shouldn't have taken this long, James. They never even asked any questions. James didn't respond immediately. He looked around at the empty road, feeling the cold wind whip against his face. The humiliation sat heavy in his chest, and he couldn't help but think about how many others, men and women without titles or badges, had been in this very position, their dignity stripped by nothing but assumptions. Finally, Michael spoke again. What are you going to do about this? James sighed, his breath visible in the night air. We'll see, he murmured. First, let's see how they handle it. The walk back. Officer Smith squared his shoulders and took a deep breath as he began walking back toward James and Michael. Johnson followed, his steps a little slower, his face still tight with shame. The sound of their boots crunching gravel echoed against the quiet night, each step an ominous drumbeat. Smith's hand shook slightly as he fumbled for the keys to the handcuffs. He stopped in front of James, his eyes darting downward, unable to meet the captain's steady gaze. There's been a mistake, Smith muttered, his voice quieter now. He stepped forward and awkwardly unlocked James's cuffs. The metal clicked open, and James slowly rubbed his wrists, which were red and raw from the pressure. Michael's cuffs came off next. The younger officer, Johnson, worked faster, his hands nimble but tense as he tried to undo the restraints without fumbling. When the cuffs fell away, Michael's sharp voice cut through the silence like a knife. A mistake? That's what you call this? Smith flinched. His lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came out. James turned to Michael and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent signal to hold back, for now. Then, James stepped forward, facing the two officers directly. His voice was calm, measured, and unshakable. You want to explain why you stopped us? Smith glanced at Johnson nervously before stammering out a rehearsed line. You matched a description. James raised an eyebrow. Of what? Smith hesitated, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. Johnson finally spoke up, his voice laced with regret. Sir, we didn't know who you were. That's not what I asked, James replied, his voice cutting through like a sharp blade. You pulled us over. You cuffed us without cause. Why? Neither officer answered. Smith looked ready to crawl into the ground, while Johnson shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Smith mumbled, You looked suspicious. James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Suspicious, he repeated. He let the word hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tell me, Officer Smith, what exactly looked suspicious about two men in suits driving home from an event? Smith couldn't answer. His throat worked like he wanted to speak, but no words came. That's what I thought, James said softly, disappointment clouding his features. A lesson in accountability. The silence stretched out until Michael broke it again. His voice rose with restrained anger. You didn't see us. You saw what you wanted to see. And let's be real, if you didn't have that badge, you'd still be standing there with your hand on your holster. Smith opened his mouth to argue, but Johnson spoke instead. You're right, he said quietly. His voice carried more weight than anyone expected. We messed up. James turned to him, his voice firm but kind. Patience isn't weakness. It's a choice. If we want to change the system, we have to be better than the ones who broke it. Michael sighed but nodded slowly. Yeah. You're right. I just hate that this keeps happening. Me too, James admitted. But that's why we have work to do. The two men climbed back into their car, the night finally quiet again. As James started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the empty road where the patrol car had disappeared. The road ahead of them was long, but James knew one thing for sure, this night would not be forgotten. It would spark something bigger. It had to. Aftershocks and reckonings. The road was silent again, but the silence felt heavier now, a weight that settled deep in both James and Michael as they drove toward home. The rhythm of the tires on asphalt echoed like a heartbeat, steady but solemn. Neither man spoke for several minutes, as though the entire night demanded quiet reflection. Michael, sitting in the passenger seat, stared out the window. The city lights passed by in soft blurs, but all he could see were the flashing blue and red lights from earlier. His jaw clenched, fists tightening on his knees. Finally, he broke the silence. James, you're too calm about this, he said, his voice sharp. Those two put cuffs on you like you were a criminal. On us. And for what? James glanced briefly at Michael, before turning his focus back to the road. His hands remained steady on the wheel, but his knuckles were pale from how hard he gripped it. He was calm on the surface, but beneath it, the anger was there, burning quietly, demanding action. Believe me, Mike, I'm not calm, James replied softly. I just know where anger gets us if we let it take over. Sometimes anger is what we need, Michael shot back. That's the problem. We always act so polite. So patient. And what changes, James? What's actually changing? James sighed, his breath slow and deliberate. You think I don't know that? He asked, glancing at his friend. I see it every day. I live it every day. I can't lose control, Mike, not if I want to fix this the right way. Michael shook his head and turned his gaze back to the window. Sometimes the right way feels like the long way. The car fell silent again as the city grew closer. Both men sat in their thoughts, the echoes of what had happened still hanging heavily between them. James's mind raced, not just about tonight but about everything this moment symbolized. How many people had been treated just as they had, or worse, and left without a voice? How many injustices had gone unspoken, unacknowledged, and unchanged? It wasn't just about two young officers who'd made a mistake. It was about a system that had failed to teach them to see beyond their assumptions. The department awaits. The next morning, the quiet hum of conversation filled the police department as officers filed in for the day shift. The atmosphere was its usual mix of light chatter and brisk professionalism, but there was something different in the air today. Something unspoken. Whispers followed James and Michael as they walked through the doors together. Heads turned, and hushed voices rippled through the room like waves on water. People knew, word of last night had already spread. Is that true? Smith and Johnson cuffed Captain Carter? No way. Tell me they didn't. They're in serious trouble. You don't mess with someone like Captain Carter. The eyes on James didn't faze him, he'd been stared at before, scrutinized in ways others could never understand. Michael, on the other hand, didn't hide his irritation. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set, ready for battle. James made his way straight to his office, his calm demeanor unshaken as usual. The nameplate on the door read, Captain James Carter. The title still held weight here, even when respect sometimes faltered. Michael followed him in, shutting the door behind him with a little too much force. "You hear all that out there?" he asked, pacing the office floor. "They're already talking. Half of them are probably just waiting to see what you're gonna do next." James sat at his desk and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Good. Let them watch." Michael stopped pacing, confusion furrowing his brow. "What's that supposed to mean?" James folded his hands, his voice steady and firm. "This isn't just about me and you, Mike. It's about every officer who needs to be reminded what they signed up for. Accountability doesn't start when you're caught. It starts with leadership." "Leadership," Michael repeated sarcastically. "Right. I'm sure those two rookies learned a lot last night, after they slapped cuffs on their own boss." James let out a small breath. "They're young. And they're not the only ones who need to learn. If we don't use this moment to teach everyone in this building, hell, in this city, then we've missed an opportunity." Michael's frustration faded slightly as he watched James's expression. He could see the fire behind his calm exterior now, a quiet, deliberate resolve that made James Carter who he was. "So what's the plan?" Michael finally asked. James didn't answer right away. He picked up a file from his desk, a case study on racial profiling and bias training he'd been working on for weeks. "We're going to hold a meeting. All departments. Everyone attends." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're really gonna get up in front of those guys and talk about this?" James looked at him unflinching. "I have to. If I don't, who will?" A room full of reflection. The following morning, the meeting room was packed. Officers sat shoulder to shoulder, their chatter echoing off the walls. Some were curious, others uneasy, but all knew this was no ordinary meeting. At the front of the room, a podium had been set up, and standing beside it was Captain James Carter. Smith and Johnson were in the front row, their postures stiff, their faces pale. Neither had slept much. Their mistakes from that night weighed heavily on them, and now, under the gaze of their colleagues, it felt even heavier. When James finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him. He looked out at the sea of faces, officers he had worked with for years, rookies just starting out, and people who had joined this profession with the hope of making a difference. "I'm not here today to assign blame," James began, his voice steady. "I'm here because we need to talk about what happened. Not because of who I am, but because of what it represents." The room remained silent as James continued, his words echoing with power. "2 nights ago, I was stopped, cuffed, and treated like a criminal because of assumptions. That's not just my story, that's the story of hundreds of people in this city and across this country. People who don't wear badges. People whose voices aren't always heard." His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Smith and Johnson, who sat motionless. "We are supposed to protect and serve," James continued, his voice rising. "But when we judge before we know, when we act before we ask, we betray that promise. We lose the trust of the people we're meant to serve. And we lose something even greater, our integrity." The room shifted, the weight of his words settling on every shoulder. Officers avoided each other's eyes, their thoughts turning inward. "Accountability doesn't make us weak," James said. "It makes us stronger. When we acknowledge our mistakes, when we learn from them, we become better. Better officers, better colleagues, and better people." He paused, his voice softer now. "If we want the public to trust us, we have to earn that trust. Every single day." The room was still. Even Michael, standing in the back of the room, watched with quiet respect as James stepped back from the podium. Ripples of change. The meeting ended with applause, not loud, but genuine. Officers filed out in silence, their minds filled with thoughts they hadn't allowed themselves to confront before. Smith and Johnson lingered behind, hesitant to approach James. Finally, Johnson stepped forward. "Captain, we..." James raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't apologize to me," he said. Apologize to every person you'll meet on this job from now on. And make sure this never happens again. Smith swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. As they left, Michael walked up to James, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'll admit it, he said. You handled that better than I would've. James chuckled softly. Patience, Mike. It's a long fight. But moments like this? They matter. Michael nodded, his smile fading slightly. Let's just hope they learned something. They did, James replied, his voice full of quiet confidence. And so did everyone else. The road to redemption. The weight of what had transpired that night didn't leave James Carter or Michael Brooks easily. It hung over them like an invisible cloud, stretching into the following days, weeks, and months. For James, it was more than just another incident. It was a brutal reminder that, despite his rank, accomplishments, and the respect he had earned over the years, he could still be reduced to a suspicious figure in the wrong circumstances. Michael, ever the more outspoken of the two, found himself unable to shake the memory either. It replayed in his head over and over, the flashing lights, the cold steel cuffs, the faces of the officers who acted before they thought. It gnawed at him like an unhealed wound. The ripple effects of that night spread through the department and the broader community like wildfire. James had hoped his speech in the precinct meeting room would serve as the catalyst for change, a wake-up call for officers who still struggled to confront their own biases. But change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't instant. A community stirred. The story of James and Michael's wrongful detainment didn't remain confined to the walls of the precinct. Somehow, news of the incident found its way to the press. At first, it was just whispers on social media, muted anger and frustration from members of the community who had long been familiar with similar experiences. But then it grew. A small online blog ran a headline. Respected police captain detained by his own men, racial bias or mistake. Soon after, larger media outlets caught wind of it. News trucks parked outside the department, journalists hounding officers for comments. The city buzzed with discussions about the incident, and everywhere James went, whether to a community meeting, a grocery store, or just walking down the street, people recognized him. You handled that better than I would've, Captain, one elderly man told him after shaking his hand. You're a good man. You're what we need in leadership, a young activist said, her voice filled with determination. But we can't let this moment slip away. People are watching. They were watching, James knew that much. But with visibility came pressure, and pressure had a way of exposing everyone's true character. An unexpected offer. One morning, James was sitting at his desk, poring over paperwork, when his office door creaked open. It was the chief of police, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Chief Hamilton, whose presence always seemed to suck the air out of the room. Morning, Carter, Hamilton said gruffly as he entered. Mind if I sit? James gestured to the chair across from his desk. Of course, Chief. Hamilton sat, adjusting his uniform before leaning forward, his expression unreadable. I'll get straight to the point, he said. The department's been getting heat ever since that incident. I don't like heat. But what I like even less is losing the community's trust. James nodded slowly. Unsure where this was going. Hamilton folded his hands. We've got a problem, Carter. Racial bias isn't something we can ignore anymore, not in this city. You know it. I know it. And whether we like it or not, everyone outside these walls knows it too. I agree, James replied evenly. Hamilton stared at him for a beat before continuing. I want you to lead something new. A program. Bias training. Community relations. Whatever it takes to address this mess head-on. Make sure nothing like this happens again, not to you, not to anyone. James blinked, taken aback. You want me to lead this? You're the best man for it, Hamilton said bluntly. You've got the respect of the department, even if some won't say it to your face. You also know what it's like on the other side. That makes you the bridge. For a moment, James sat in silence. He thought about the implications, what it would mean to lead such a program, how much resistance he might face, and how much the community would expect from him. It was no small task. But as the faces of Smith, Johnson, and countless others flashed through his mind, he realized it was the opportunity he needed to take. "All right," James said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Hamilton's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though a weight had been lifted. "Good. You'll have my full backing." James nodded, but his mind was already racing with ideas and plans. Confronting resistance. The announcement of James's new program, officially called the Community Trust Initiative, sent ripples through the department. Some officers welcomed the change, seeing it as an overdue step toward fixing long-standing issues. Others, however, were less receptive. Bias training? Seriously, one officer grumbled in the break room. Like I don't already know how to do my job. Next thing you know, we'll have to apologize for pulling someone over, another muttered. James heard the comments, of course. They didn't surprise him. Change made people uncomfortable, and for many, it felt like an accusation rather than an opportunity to improve. The first day of training was tense. Officers filed into the room with wary expressions, arms crossed defensively. Among them were Smith and Johnson, both of whom had been ordered to attend every session. They sat near the back, avoiding eye contact with anyone. James stood at the front of the room, his voice calm but firm as he opened the session. "I know some of you think this training is a waste of time. I know some of you think it doesn't apply to you. But let me be clear, this isn't about calling anyone out. It's about looking in the mirror. It's about making sure we're the kind of officers this community can trust." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If you're wearing this badge, you owe it to the people out there, and to yourself, to get this right." Some heads nodded slowly, while others remained stiff with resistance. James expected this. Change would be slow, but he wasn't back down. Building bridges. The program didn't stop at the precinct doors. James made it clear that officers needed to show up in the community, not as enforcers, but as neighbors. He organized community forums, inviting residents to share their experiences and grievances. At the first forum, the room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of frustration, hope, and skepticism. Michael was there, standing off to the side, his arms crossed as he observed the crowd. A young black man stood up and addressed the room. "You want to know why we don't trust the police? Because you don't see us. You see criminals. You see suspects. Not people." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Smith and Johnson, seated near the back, looked visibly uncomfortable. James stepped forward and met the young man's gaze. "You're right," he said simply. "That's why we're here. To listen. And to do better." The young man looked surprised by the honesty in James's voice. "Talking's not enough," he said after a pause. "It's not," James agreed. "But it's a start. A long road forward." Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the department began to change. Officers who had once resisted the program began to see its value. Community members started showing up to forums not just to complain but to collaborate. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Smith and Johnson became some of the program's biggest advocates. Smith, who had once been so defensive, now told rookies, "Take your time. Ask questions. Don't assume." One evening, as James walked to his car after another long day, Michael appeared beside him. "You know, you might actually pull this off," he said, smiling. James chuckled, shaking his head. "We're just getting started, Mike. There's still a long way to go." Michael clapped him on the shoulder. "Then let's keep going." Together, they walked into the night, knowing that change was slow, but it was happening. The ripple becomes a wave. Months had passed since that fateful night when James Carter and Michael Brooks were unjustly detained. What started as a humiliating and frustrating incident had now become the seed for something far bigger, a movement that had begun to change hearts, minds, and systems. For James, every day was a step forward, though the road ahead was long and uneven. The Community Trust Initiative had expanded well beyond the department's expectations. Officers were now engaging directly with the community through regular events, trust-building sessions, and open forums. The most surprising development, however, came from the officers themselves. Some who had initially resisted the program became its fiercest supporters. For James, this was both rewarding and humbling. He didn't seek praise or recognition, he simply wanted change, real, lasting change that would outlive his time in uniform. A humble victory. It was a cold, bright morning when James stood at the front of a packed auditorium in City Hall. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, members of the police department, community leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The event, titled Bridging the Divide, A Community Unites, was a milestone, a culmination of months of effort, growth, and uncomfortable conversations. James adjusted the microphone as the chatter died down. His calm, steady presence filled the room before he even spoke. Michael, standing off to the side, gave him an encouraging nod. "Good morning," James began, his deep voice resonating through the room. "When I was a young officer, fresh out of the academy, I had a lot of ideas about what policing meant. I thought wearing this badge was enough to earn trust. I thought doing my job by the book was enough to prove my integrity. But I learned that trust is not given, it's earned. And for too long, we have been asking for trust without earning it." A hushed silence fell over the room as James paused, his words hanging heavy in the air. "I stand here today because of a mistake, an unjust incident that reminded me, and all of us, that we still have work to do. But mistakes can lead to growth. They can lead to change. And change starts with each of us looking in the mirror and asking ourselves hard questions." He looked out into the crowd, his eyes landing briefly on Smith and Johnson, who sat quietly near the back. Their transformation had been one of James's most personal victories. They hadn't just attended the training sessions, they had embraced them. Smith, the once defensive officer, now ran workshops on de-escalation and implicit bias. Johnson, quieter and more introspective, had become an advocate for community engagement. James continued, his tone soft but firm. "To the officers in this room, you didn't take this job to be feared. You took it to protect, to serve, and to be a part of something bigger than yourself. To do that, we need to see the people we serve, not as problems to solve but as neighbors, friends, and human beings. To the community members here, I know trust is hard to rebuild. I know it's been broken too many times. But I promise you this, we're listening. We're learning. And we're committed to doing better." As he spoke, heads nodded in agreement. There were no empty platitudes here. James's words carried the weight of action, of months spent pushing forward when resistance stood in his way. The crowd erupted into applause as James stepped back from the podium. Some clapped politely, others rose to their feet, cheering for a man who was quietly becoming the face of a new kind of leadership, one that demanded accountability, humility, and humanity. Redemption and reflection. After the event, James found himself shaking hands with community members and fellow officers. Smith and Johnson approached cautiously, their expressions sincere but hesitant. "Captain," Smith said, his voice quieter than it had once been. "I just wanted to say, thank you." James raised an eyebrow. "Thank me?" "For not giving up on us," Johnson added. "You could have written us off that night. You could have ended our careers. But instead, you gave us a chance to learn. I know we can't take back what happened, but we're trying to make it right." James studied them both for a moment before nodding. "Accountability doesn't mean we give up on people," he said. "It means we hold them to a higher standard. I'm proud of the progress you've made, but remember, it doesn't stop here. You've got a responsibility now. Don't forget that." Smith and Johnson both nodded, their faces filled with resolve. As they turned to leave, Michael walked over, shaking his head with a grin. "Look at you," Michael said, smirking. "Turning them into role models. You're like the department's Mr. Miyagi." James chuckled. "Patience and persistence, Mike. That's how we win this." Michael's grin faded into something more serious. "You know, I didn't think you'd pull this off. I thought it would end up being another nice idea that got buried under politics. But you proved me wrong." James smiled faintly. "It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about doing the work, one step at a time." A surprise visit. Weeks later, James received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was the young activist who had spoken passionately at one of the early community forums, a woman named Alicia Stone. "Captain Carter," Alicia said as she entered, her sharp eyes studying him. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't need to thank me," James replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm just doing my job." Alicia tilted her head. "It's more than that, though. You're doing what a lot of people in power won't do. You're listening. You're trying to fix what's broken. That means something." James nodded slowly. "Change takes all of us, Alicia. This isn't my work alone. It's yours, too. It's every officer in that department, every resident in this city. We all have to do our part." She smiled, a spark of hope in her expression. "We're planning another community event next month. You should come." "I'll be there," James said without hesitation. A legacy of change. Months turned into a year, and the changes James had worked so hard to implement began to take root. Community complaints against the police dropped significantly, and trust surveys showed progress that few had thought possible. Officers in James's department became known for their willingness to engage with residents, not just in moments of crisis, but in everyday life. More importantly, the shift wasn't superficial. Officers were beginning to hold each other accountable. The culture of silence that had once protected bad behavior was cracking. New recruits entered the academy knowing that their badge was a symbol of trust, not power. One evening, James stood on the steps of City Hall, watching families and officers mingle at a community barbecue. Children played while officers helped serve food and drinks, their badges catching the golden glow of the setting sun. Michael walked up beside him, a plate of food in hand. "You see this?" he said, gesturing toward the scene. "This is what change looks like." James smiled softly, his heart full. "It's just the beginning, Mike. But yeah. This is what it's supposed to look like." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gathering, James allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, there would always be work to do. But for now, the ripple he had started had grown into a wave. And waves, he knew, could change the tide.